Okay, part three. In part three, we kind of move away from the border line, but we do talk about things like trade agreements and domestic law, because remember, for us, the border not only is represented by a single line that divides a here and a there, but it also encloses and defines particular jurisdictions where the law is applicable, where in this case, or of concern to this case, where issues related to tariffs, to taxes, to duties are applicable, but also with things related to standards, standards in commodity, standards in labor employment relations, and so forth take place. So all of this, and I just realized there is a typo here, tend to be called behind the border measures. So we're concerned in this part three with things that do not take place at the border itself, but across the national jurisdiction, whose territorial limits are defined by border lines. And so, in terms of trade facilitation, in terms of enabling the inflow of foreign direct investment, in terms of fostering the integration of national economies into regional and global economies, the first thing, the thing that has not changed since structural adjustment programs, is to open up and liberalize the economy, which in the specific context of trade relates to the reduction of tariffs, right? So import duties need to be scrapped. I mean, the more costs are attached to producing a commodity or an object in one place and trying to sell it into another place, well, the less likely that sale or that commodity will be competitive on the market, right? And again, by costs, I mean both costs related to the transport times and the transport cost associated to it, but also to the costs that increase the price, such as tariffs. So reduction of tariffs is the first and foremost measure that is applicable when it comes to fostering integration. A liberalized economy is an economy that does not create divisions by imposing tariffs for things that cross the border. But it's not just that, it's much more than that. It's about non-tariff measures. This is what is usually called as behind the border measure, and they refer to any policy measure that can have an impact on trade flows. Things such as import quotas, right? So I will not import more than, I'm not sure what is the measure for rice import, but there are no tariffs on importing rice, but it is not allowed to import more than 500 cubic tons of rice per month or something like this, right? So there is a quota on the amount of particular commodities that can be traded. Import prohibitions. I have no tariffs, you can sell whatever you want in my market, in the national economy, but not rice, right? Because we have a rice industry and we want to protect it, right? So that is not conducive to a deep integration of the national economy into the global economy, because it is protecting, it creates divisions, it creates distortion in the market, right? The abstract, quintessential neoclassical theory is that in absence of this, the market will self-regulate, and if you produce rice at a more expensive price than the rice you can import, you should not be producing. But clearly that's a purely even if it were to be true in its classical formulation, it's a proposition that abstracts from any other political or politico-economic considerations, such as, and I just gave an example, the protection of particular sectors of the economy. Customs procedures, import licensing. Yes, I can import everything. There is no import tariff, but there are only 4 authorized import dealers through which you have to go, etc., etc. The same can go on export quotas, export prohibition, voluntary export restraints, etc., etc. Importantly, I think, from our perspective at least, are all those non-tariff measures that relate to things such as domestic legislation covering health, technical specification, environmental concerns, labor rights. So take the example of labor standards, right? And campaigns such as fair trade, right? That in a positive sense, I would tend to say, they try to define what can or could not be exported, or the type of things that are acceptable for sale in particular markets on the basis of labor standards. Importantly, these issues are also, or indeed environmental standards, that cannot be standards in that respect that are violated. And this is not just kind of corporate initiatives such as fair trade, but also, and increasingly, these non-tariff measures are part and parcels of EU trade agreements in this subject. And in fact, we will talk later about a reading that I recommend by Campling and others from 2013 of 16 that talks specifically about labor standards. Right? So, point being that we are looking at 2 things here. On one side, there is trade liberalization, which is about opening up market to international trade by reducing taxes or tariffs and other limits on goods coming out. On the other hand, we're talking about standards and regulatory homogenization, right? So the reduction of legal and administrative and regulatory differences across jurisdictions is what it is about. What standards for corporate governance, what kind of reporting measures are set in place in a national economy that give trust to me, foreign investor, in buying up your company and trusting the accounts upon which the evaluation of the cost or the price I want to pay for your company are premised. Sanitary measures. How do I know that there are no forbidden chemicals in the toys that you produce? Think about the debate in the UK, at least, about chlorinated chicken coming from the US, i.e. A process through which major chicken producers in the US clean chickens, and a process that is considered illegal in places like Europe, i.e. not meeting standards, sanitary standards that are satisfactory for the European Union, etc., etc., etc. Right? So these are the other things, the kind of the other side of the coin of the at the border measures. And there are different ways in which this has been described. I mean, a common way is the distinction between shallow integration and deep integration. And in fact, increasingly, trade agreements that take place nowadays relate to deep integration agreements, which establish or expand the institutional environment in order to facilitate trade and location of production without regard to national borders. What are the elements? We kind of went through. These are different kind of ways of talking about this. It's a regulatory harmonization, so have the same set of standards across jurisdictions when it comes to technical regulations or indeed institutional structures and so on and so forth. Now, by far, the kind of policy that has been pursued more vigorously and for the longest period of time are regional trade agreements, or regional free trade agreements, RFTAs, right? And there is a strong support across literature from different parts of the world that support the establishment of regional trade agreements, quite often as a step towards global integration, but certainly as an objective to be pursued in order to integrate the national economy into the broader market. And you can find traces of the positive assessment of trade agreements in documents such as the World Development Report of 2009, in NEPAD, older NEPAD, New Economic Partnership for African Development, in the Asian Development Bank, all of which from slightly similar perspective, albeit perhaps kind of declined in relation to the national context or to the regional context rather, try to promote regional trade agreements which promote a deeper integration, so go beyond the shallow integration as the policy measure that is necessary to enable and foster circulation of financial flows, capital investment, and commodities, right? And in fact, if you look at the spread of regional trade agreements across the world, well, you can see how, they have massively increased. Now, these figures are perhaps slightly inaccurate in the sense that quite a lot of trade agreements are not active as such. In other words, that they may have been signed, but there are either delays to their implementation or a lack of implementation altogether because some of the conditions that were agreed in the official document have not yet been met. But certainly it paints a picture of the trend associated to this proliferation, right? Not only that, so not only the number of RTAs as recorded in the WTO has increased, the absolute number, but also the number of regional partners that each country is engaged with has multiplied or rapidly expanded, especially so from the late 1990s. Again, try to think about when it comes to periodizations, the various periods which we've been discussing over the last 3 or 4 weeks, and you will see parallels in this respect, right? So not only the absolute number of regional trade agreements has increased, but also each country has entered into a partnership, a trade agreement with with an increasing amount of countries. This is what this graph shows. A graph that also shows how, that is a general trend. It's not specified to any particular region in the world, but covers high income, middle income, and low income countries alike. Of course, the high income countries figure higher in this respect and in this graph. Interestingly, there has also been an increase and a proliferation in South-South agreements. So again, this is another graph that shows the amount of developing countries agreements has massively increased, and you can find examples from the Caribbean and CARICOM to Pacto Andino to various regional communities in Western Africa and Eastern Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia. So there is an increased interest, concern that actually has evolved over the last 2 or 3 decades in considering this the main institutional form through which economic integration can be achieved and should be pursued. Furthermore, another way of looking at this, increasingly the number of deep trade agreements, i.e. agreements that go beyond a mere concern with tariffs and taxes and quotas, but actually actively transform the regulatory environment in the signature, in the country's signature to the agreement, has increased. Okay. So, point being that these graphs wanted to show how regional trade agreements are seen and have been used as the main institutional form through which to achieve economic integration, through which to foster circulation. As a set of agreements and policies that are of concern to us because they reduce difference across jurisdictions, right? So while in the first part we looked at the border measures, in this part we were more concerned with the policies that reduce the jurisdictional differences when it comes to environmental laws, labor laws, sanitary protocols and standards, regulatory and business environment, court adjudication and the rule of law, business practices, accounting practices, reporting practices, etc., 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 that are increasingly homogenized so that ultimately capital can move around, investment can move around across a relatively or increasingly homogeneous institutional framework. Now, are these border management projects likely to achieve expected results, is our question. Or indeed, what are the conditions of possibility for these trade agreements and border management policies to be successful? It's kind of the same question related to the context in which at the border policies take place, but seen from a different perspective. So what I would like you to do now is to divide yourself in groups. I will hopefully be able to do so, and take Aniches and Ukagbu reading from 2016, which is quite a thick reading, and therefore I would ask you kindly to identify, first of all, and then discuss the main argument presented there, and why they take somewhat of a critical stance or highlight some of the contradictions associated to free trade agreements. Now, all your points, I'm sure, were very good. What I wanted to go through now are a series of very quick recollecting very quickly some of the key positions that you can find in the field that attempt to answer the question, do these agreements work? So if on one side, I mean, at its broadest, you find organizations such as the World Bank that see only benefits that arise from greater trade integration, you have other organizations such as Tradecraft, represented in the last paragraph of this slide, that actually take a contrarian view. There is now ample evidence which shows that this liberalization agenda actually increases poverty, especially imposing, etc., etc. So perhaps they're measuring or they are considering different sources of evidence, and they have different concerns in and on themselves. The same organizations that are actually actively promoting integration have contrasting views on the matter. And so, for example, people like the World Bank in the World Development Report of 2009 think that, well, yes, regional free trade agreements are good, but ultimately a global trade agreement would be the best possible outcome, because that homogenization across jurisdictions, the wider it is, the better it is for trade. Obviously, a very similar position of that of the WTO, who says regional trade agreements can play an important role in promoting the liberalization and expansion of trade and in fostering development. But regional agreements also risk making it harder for countries outside the region to trade with those inside. Again, here we go back to that neoclassical assumption that the more the market is a level playing field, the more the invisible hand of the market will efficiently and effectively allocate resources to the benefits of all. But it's kind of an argument, even assuming this is the case in its economic formulation, that eschews any sort of political or non-economic consideration. So those organizations that are actively promoting those agreements also highlight or are aware of some of the contradictions even within their own logics. Others point to the uneven benefits that these trade agreements produce. So, for example, workers in industries exposed to intensified competition experience a reduction in pay. I mean, certainly this may be the case in many places, not necessarily all. But there is a relation there between globalized sectors and more localized sectors of the economy. Many have talked about the concentration, the geographical concentration and unevenness that entering into a trade agreement, especially with a larger economy, and this was one of the points in the Anicha readings, may produce on other countries, and so on and so forth. I mean, there are different aspects being highlighted, and perhaps this is not the place here to go through all of them. Certainly, the point of uneven benefits, or who benefits from those agreements, is one at the heart of our concerns when we want to assess the possibilities that through such policies we can achieve development. There is also case-specific evidence. This is the Campling article that talks about EU trade agreements and how ultimately, even if they incorporate concerns for labor governance, the outcomes or the effects of these in practice need to be carefully scrutinized. And so to me, all of this is to say that we need to go back to some of the basic questions with which to approach, and the way in which we ended up the first group exercise when we thought about the relation between context and the possibility of success of those one-stop border policies, and the way in which we end up this kind of second group exercise once again points to that key question of conditions. What are the conditions for cross-border trade facilitation to be successful? And obviously it's a set of questions that also highlight how the success of those policies may take different forms depending on who you ask or what are your concerns. So a first level would be to think about the political commitment and indeed interest of countries involved in the success of any agreement or any integration. Nietzsche's article, again, it is quite useful in this respect. But we also need to think about what was happening before and what would happen in absence of these projects and agreements. In other words, how the way in which trade was conducted before the agreement actually shaped the way in which, with an agreement, trade patterns and standards take place. Who is going to lose out from this project? Who is going to benefit from this project? And really, is this just about trade facilitation? I mean, perhaps one of the biggest contradictions that are associated to all these set of policies is that between the promotion of such policies that aim at speeding up markets that are exclusively premised on economic considerations and a whole series of political, geopolitical, or politico-economic considerations that actually are what makes or doesn't make this project successful.